Hey everyone, and welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel. Today we end up with more questions than answers as we continue our discussion on the Albigensian Crusade or Albigensian genocide. Be right back. If one analyzing the primary sources and potential motives of those surrounding the Albigensian heresy and crusade, it may go something like this. Pope Innocent III wanted to continue spreading the church. He wanted to go on crusade into the Holy Land, but could not with such a growing non-Catholic presence in his own region, southern France, Albi. Even if they meant no harm to the church, their pacifism and lack of centralized organization compared to that of their neighbors may have made a welcome target for Saracen invasion. Those charged with carrying out the crusade stood to gain a great deal in the way of land, title, alliance with the church, and power. Simon de Montfort particularly, who had proved his level of moral virtue already by having walked away from the Fourth Crusade. So why was he so eager to participate in this one? It would be his relative who wrote the early definitive history of the Albigensian conflict from a monastery. And what of the Albigensians themselves? They aimed to protect an independence and liberty found nowhere else. What made it difficult for them were such a mix of different beliefs interspersed with Roman Catholicism that rooting it out meant families would literally be torn apart. Even historians documenting the events had a dog in the fight. Firstly, to try to justify what appears as unnecessary and wanton violence. Even today's historians and theologians are conflicted on how and why these events occurred. The church-friendly narrative is that the Albigensians were dualists, believing in a good God and a bad God. By physical migration to the region of Albi, southern France, many of the earlier heresies of the church were assigned to the region and its people. In order to justify the actions of the church as noble, the Albigensians needed to be demons. Later historians, relying on texts produced by those involved, those trying to justify the actions of the church, and those trying to use the narrative to point to the evil of the church, assigned many of the heresies from the previous 1,000 years to the Albigensians, whether they fit or not. The beliefs of earlier groups like Donatists, Paulicians, Adoptionists, and while not by name, but by description of the heresy itself, they allegedly committed groups like Manichaeans, Novatianists, Arians to these 13th century Albigensians. So the hard part about telling an honest narrative of this important part of history is that the people of that time had definitely given the church the authority to frame objective reality, to say what truth was. That being the case, do subsequent generations of historians have the obligation to then uphold that position? It is difficult to find justification for the event by modern Christian standards. At the time, however, and much later, the church truly believed heretics to be a poison worthy of death. Thomas Aquinas wrote on law, morality, and politics, should heretics be tolerated? While he pointed to several scriptures where clergy could attempt to reason with the heretic, the arm of the church was there to come down upon them. Ultimately, Aquinas echoed the view of the Catholic Church that, quote, they, heretics, by their sins, indeed deserve to be both separated from the church by excommunication and excluded from the world by death. But the church is merciful in order to convert those in error, and so the church condemns heretics only after admonishing them once or twice, as the apostles teach, end quote. The church father Augustine truly believed that heretics aimed to corrupt the church, not that they just had a differing view and wanted to practice the faith in the way they desired. So was the church justified in going on a crusade against tens of thousands, up to millions of people in southern France and seeing them killed and their way of life destroyed? Were those that carried out the crusade morally wrong? Or were the Albigensians morally wrong for having a belief that was contrary to Orthodox Christianity? In order to answer any of these questions, we have to first answer a more important question. Does a historian telling of these events have to uphold the right to frame objective reality that the church had at the beginning of the 13th century? Do we have to take their position because what they said was truth? What can be done is framing the narrative without assuming bad intent on anybody's part. Then it looks different. Pope Innocent III wants to grow the church. Pope Innocent III is looking at France, who is the engine of the Crusades, and a large part of France is not with his program. The people involved in carrying out the crusade live in a time where they believe heresy is a moral wrong and it is their obligation to root it out. The Albigensians simply want to live in peace. Many accounts show that they realized these belief systems were a problem, but it wasn't one entire group of people. It was interspersed in their belief system. It wasn't everybody. Were the Albigensians really heretics? There is no question that the Albigensians held some heretical views by the standards of the church in the early 13th century. However, it may be impossible to define exactly which ones were authentically theirs. Many of the heresies of the church up to the time of the Albigensians were assigned to them by name. However, if you go to the source of those particular heresies, they don't show a lineage down to the Albigensians. So what does that tell us? Does that suggest revisionism by later sources? If that's the case, we have to give the Albigensians the respect of that lineage. The Cathars were viewed as intellectuals in that they read the scriptures and believed that the enlightenment of the spirit was born through building the mind. That's not necessarily a heretical view. They also realized a change of heart meant repentance, which to them came in the form of baptism, opening the heart to the faith. That's not necessarily heretical. Their assessment of what God was viewed Catholicism's God as the primary target of scorn. That's heretical. Finally, they were firm in their contemplative nature and prayerful visualizations for life. They were perhaps the most spiritually balanced movement of all the heresies of the church. That is, of course, if we don't assume bad intent, and we assume that the Albigensians just had a range of views and that it was later necessary for the Catholic Church to further demonize in order to justify their actions. At the same time, it's highly possible that there were groups inside of the broader Albigensian community that held very, very firm views against Roman Catholicism, and that even held views that could be seen as Luciferian, Kabbalistic, or dualistic. In any event, the Catholic Church continued to reaffirm her spiritual and temporal authority on paper. Yet every time threats arose to her absolute authority or stood to erode assets that would otherwise flow to Rome, she could be brutal in seeking remedies. It should be noted that the charge of heresy against Cathar practices was both ethical and legal by the law of the time. With that in mind, and noting Pope Innocent's rabid devotion to following the canon and administrative law of the Church, a picture becomes clearer about what might have happened. We will find out next time, and I thank you for listening. I look forward to talking to you next time when we take a look at the actual crusade, events of the crusade, and what the primary sources of the time had to say. Talk to you next time.